Hey everybody, this is Sashi Loju again, and today we're going to go over the DMEK procedure how we do it at the Casey Eye Institute. We're going to start with graft preparation. We're lucky here because the Portland Eye Bank actually pre-cuts DMEK tissue. So we obtain our tissue, place it in our block, and stain it with trypan blue. We let the trypan sit for about 30 seconds to a minute and draw it up using wax spears, being careful not to touch the endothelium. This will help us manipulate the tissue better. After that, we center the tissue in the block, and we use a 8.25 millimeter punch here to cut through the tissue. In this case, we noticed that the scleral rim was still attached to the blade, so we actually remove it and approximate it back to where it was placed. And this is so that when we manipulate the tissue, we don't want the scroll to end up touching the plastic. Put a few drops of Optisol back in. And now what we do is we're removing the excess Descemet tissue off of this scleral rim. And the Descemet membrane that's pre-cut is still attached where that little V scroll is. So you take a pair of tires and separate that tissue. After it's been fully separated from the underlying stroma, you remove as much of the Optisol and then place trypan blue to help stain it. This segment of staining is done for several minutes, and this is so that you get a deep stain to help visualize it once you put it in the eye. So now we are starting with the actual stripping portion. We start by making 3 paracenteses, one superiorly, one nasally, and one inferiorly. Now we're injecting Helon GV into the eye. It's very important to use a cohesive viscoelastic and not a dispersive one. This will really help with graft adherence. We're using an 8.0 circular marker there to make an indentation on the cornea, and then we are just marking those areas to give us a rubric for our stripping, which we're about to do. We use a reverse Sinski hook. Well, before we get there, we're going to have to make our main wound. We're using a 2.75 millimeter blade here. And after the main wound's made, we use a bent 30-degree needle to make a inferior paracentesis. It's very important that you are peripheral enough so that you don't clip the capsule, but not too peripheral so that you end up having bleeding from the ciliary body. Here we're using a reverse Sinski hook to score along our pre-made mark, and then we strip it just as if we're doing any DSEK procedure. Once the tissue has essentially been stripped, we're using a pair of Charlies here to remove the tissue from the eye. I also like to scrape the peripheral borders, but not centrally, and this is to help have some graft adherence. And this is done 360 degrees. Next we go in with the Irrigain IA, and we essentially are removing all of the Helon, being very, very thorough to get all of it out. And then I'm also going in and kind of squeegeeing the back surface of the cornea to help remove any remaining segments that may be there. In this case, we had a little bit of iris prolapse. This was an older gentleman. So we just inject a little bit of myocol to get our pupil back down. So here I'm going in and widening the incision. It's a 2.75, and in an eye that doesn't have any viscoelastic, it's very hard to put your injector into the wound. So I'm extending to about 3.2 millimeters or so. So now we're going to get into the graft loading. What we use here is a so first things first is we take off as much of the trypan there, and you notice that you have a scrolled up tissue there. We use an IOL injector off of one of the BNL IOL injectors, and we prepare this by snapping the tip of it off and connecting to the IA tubing off of the Alcon Infinity machine, which is then subsequently connected to a 3 millimeter syringe filled with BSS. Okay, we make sure to get all the air bubbles out, and here we're grabbing just the very edge of the DMEK tissue and basically placing it right into the IOL injector. Then it's very important to try to get into that wound and make sure your whole tip is inside before you start to try to inject the graft. And you can have a second person help fill the chamber using one of the other paracenteses. So there was a little bit more of a traumatic entry than I would have liked. However, you just want to have very soft squirts of the BSS to help get the graft within the eye. After the graft is in the eye, it's important to suture your main wound. Grafts can fly back out of the main wound, and that's something you don't want to happen. Next, you want to manipulate the graft into place, and the key here is maintaining the proper anterior chamber depth. If you have a chamber that's too deep, the graft will want to scroll into itself, and if you have a chamber that's too shallow, it's going to be tough to get the graft to move. So you got to find the right balance there. And here what we're doing is the graft appears to have scrolled on itself, so we're basically injecting currents of BSS to help get the edge of the graft to unfold. Once we got it unfolded, it appears that we have this double scroll configuration here, which is now being unfolded, and that's the ideal configuration that you want to have. And what you want to do is you want to do gentle taps on the cornea to produce aqueous currents that will help open the graft up. Okay, and here once again we're just kind of modulating anterior chamber depth to make it ideal for the graft to move. And one of the things, if you're in doubt of if you have the right configuration or not, is to essentially put your BSS cannula in, find one of the edges of where you think the fold is, and sweep across. If your tissue starts to unfold when you sweep across and you're between the recipient cornea and the implant, then you know you're in the right configuration. So once again, kind of gentle taps to get it moved over into place, and it looks like I've got a fairly large fold. So what I'm going to do here is just use two different cannulas. One cannula to kind of fixate the graft into place temporally, and then tap with the other cannula to help it unfold. And essentially after this step, the graft's actually in very good position, so really doesn't require too much more manipulation. So going actually in through the main wound, you can also go in through the paracentesis. Make sure to get underneath the graft, get to the center of the pupil, and inject your air bubble to essentially lock the graft into position. Here some of the air is actually leaked out, so I'm actually going through the inferior paracentesis and doing 100% air fill. So anyways, hope you learned something. Thanks.